Here I have two universal earthing kits, which I'm going to be installing in my NC MX-5 or Miata. Now you can get vehicle-specific earthing kits from big name tuner brands, but they cost a lot of money. I mean, like for the price of one of those branded vehicle-specific kits, I can get 5 or 6 of these universal kits. So instead of one, I got 2 of these kits from Amazon, and I just thought wherever I need to, I'll just cut them and recrimp them to the right length that I need. So first step is disconnecting and removing the battery box. I've actually got another video where I go into details of how to do that, and I've linked that in the description below. Now I want to show you this one mod I've done to my battery box cover. This thing is probably the single most over-engineered part on this entire car. It's got 4 claws to lock it in place onto the battery box, 2 on either side. So in order to remove it, you have to first move this breather hose off of it. You need to use both hands and lift up both claws and then lift the whole thing up. And it's no mystery that so many of these battery covers end up cracking from those parts where the claws are. So what I did is I cut all of those claws off, sanded it down flat, and now the only thing that holds this on is actually that breather hose that sits on the left side. And that's really all you need. With that hose in place and the hood closed, this thing isn't going anywhere. In fact, you could get rid of the cover altogether and it's not going to do any harm. So now with battery and the battery box out, I want to actually swap my positive terminal, the main one. And the reason I want to do that is I want to use this terminal here, which has 2 bolts, and I want to use a ring terminal on the main positive lead so that I can easily unbolt it whenever I want, and I can swap the terminals out whenever I need to. Also, if I decide to add an aftermarket amplifier, I can wire that directly over to this terminal, and I can use the other bolt and just a ring terminal and bolt it on that way. Just makes everything more modular and easy to disassemble and reassemble and swap things out. So I cut off the original positive terminal, stripped the wires, and crimped on a brand new ring terminal. Now these are really thick wires, so I got a ring terminal with an open barrel, which is 4 super thick gauge wire, and I had to use a super beefy crimper to get that terminal on as well. And later in this video, I'll have some better footage to show you how I did the same thing with the earthing cables. So I'm just kind of test fitting all the different lengths of wires in the universal kit, and I'm kind of trying to see where I need to shorten and recrimp any of them. Now the general idea with these earthing or grounding kits is that they're supposed to help improve the ground connection. They're supposed to give the electrical current a shorter, more direct path to flow to the negative terminal on the battery. And by having a better ground connection, you'll have less resistance in that circuit, and less resistance means you're going to have a more efficiently working electrical circuit, and that's going to improve anything that's electrical. That's the theory, but I doubt this is actually going to have any noticeable benefit whatsoever. So there isn't excessive resistance in the first place that you need to actually be taking care of. I mean, it's not the case with any car the way it is when it comes out the factory. The only time I can see this maybe being of any benefit is if you've got like some really high power aftermarket sound system. I'm talking about the kind of stuff you'd see in show cars back in like the late 90s and early 2000s, where you'd have an entire trunk that's just filled with subwoofers and amps and that sort of thing. The main reason why I'm doing this is that I wanted to do the positive terminal on the battery anyway, and I also wanted to change like this kind of ugly, uninsulated piece of like exposed wire that goes from the alternator bracket to the negative battery terminal. I mean, that's how it's supposed to be, and that's how the car is from the factory, but I just think that looks really unsightly. So in a nutshell, the reason I'm doing this earthing kit is mainly cosmetic. It's not for anything performance related. All right, so let me show you how I've set it up on my car. So I'm starting with this bolt here on the firewall. There are 2 of them kind of in line with each other, one above the other. I decided to go with the lower bolt just because it's easier to access using a long extension and a 10mm socket. Now I've routed that along this little plastic grill on the base of the windshield, and I've used a little zip tie to hold it in place right there. And I've routed it around to this 10mm bolt on the fender here. And then from there, it's going around past the washer fluid bottle to the alternator bracket. And from the alternator bracket going directly to the battery negative terminal. The last one is the same as it was originally. I've just swapped it with a nicer looking insulated wire. And on the other side, I've tried to make it as symmetrical as possible. Started with that bolt on the firewall, the same as on the other side. Routed it around to the fender over here, and then from the 10mm bolt right next to it, I've routed it down to this little point over here on this kind of horizontal flat area. If you have a left-hand drive car, this might be a bit harder to access. From here, I've routed it here down to the front and across, following the positive wires from the ECU, and I bolted that to the same point on the chassis where the original ground cable goes from the battery to the chassis. And I've also swapped that original ground cable for a fancy looking red insulated ground wire. Now let me show you how I cut and crimped my connections. Cut them using my big fat crimper, which also has gauge cutters on it. Stripped the wires, which I didn't have a proper stripper for, so I just used a utility knife to do that. And the way I insulated these ends is kind of what I like to do personally. It's not the way that everybody does it. I have the heat shrink obviously, but before I put the heat shrink on and heat it up and shrink it down, I like to wrap that crimp terminal with some electrical tape or vinyl tape. And then I put the heat shrink on top of that and then heat it up and shrink it down with my heat gun. The reason I do that is because the heat shrink is not anywhere near as tear resistant or abrasion resistant as the vinyl electrical tape. So the vinyl electrical tape is going to give it that additional strength, and the heat shrink will give it that nice and tidy looking professional finish. And it's also going to make sure that the vinyl tape doesn't kind of start unwinding or get unwrapped with the adhesive failing. Now before we put everything back together, there's a final step, and that's a little bit more preventative maintenance. I've just put in a brand new battery, and I want to prevent corrosion from like the gases from the battery and battery acid. So I got these anti-corrosion felt washers. The way these are supposed to work is they have some anti-corrosive chemicals in them, and by sitting them on your battery terminals, they are supposed to prevent corrosion. I'm not totally convinced with how they work because I'm not sure if those chemicals are going to kind of evaporate and, you know, leave these as just plain felt pads that do absolutely nothing. So I'm also going to add some dielectric grease, just a tiny little bit, on my finger and just spread that all across both terminals. So the dielectric grease combined with whatever effect these felt pads have, and worst case scenario, even if the felt pads do absolutely nothing at all, they are going to at least catch some of that battery acid and prevent it from like flowing elsewhere and onto the bodywork. And there we go, going to torque everything down and put the cover back on, and we're all done. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you got some ideas. If you use any of the links in the description below, they are affiliate links, so they'll help me out a lot and I appreciate it. And even if you don't, that's still cool. I still appreciate you stopping by and watching the video. Have a great day.